All right, it's currently 1 p.m. Eastern, so we'll go ahead and kick things off. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second session of NBAA's Single Pilot Safety Stand-Down, the event leading off our week of aviation excellence. My name is Phil Durner, NBAA's Western Regional Representative and your webinar producer. Before we get started, I'd like to show you a few features of this webinar platform. We'll be accepting questions to ask our speakers. To ask a question, please type it into the Q&A window on your screen. All submitted questions will be 100% anonymous from the rest of the audience. Also, keep an eye on the public chat as we will be adding links and additional updates throughout the duration of the webinar. We would also like to take a moment to thank our generous platinum level sponsor for this session, Textron Aviation. We have a video provided by Textron Aviation that we would like to share with you before introducing today's panel. All right, that was a great video, Textron. Thank you so much. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ed Bolin, President and CEO of the National Business Aviation Association, to get our session started. Ed?
Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you, Textron Aviation, for sponsoring this very special program. And once again, I'd like to welcome everybody to Aviation Excellence Week. This morning, we had an opportunity to hear from Tom Huff and Todd Hodis, Chris Provencio, on setting a foundation for single pilot safety. This afternoon, we'd like to build on that foundation by bringing in our friends with the Citation Jet Pilots and having them lead us through some scenario training that I think you will find enormously helpful and informative. To lead us off, I'm going to turn it over to David Miller, who is the Director of Safety and Programs for the Citation Jet Pilots. David has a remarkable career as a business person and as a pilot. He has over 6,000 hours flying multiple types of aircraft. He also writes a monthly column for Twin and Turbine called On Final, where he shares some of his experiences flying in the cockpit. So, David, I'm going to turn it over to you and your extraordinary team with the Citation Jet Pilots for what I know is going to be a very important session of our single pilot safety stand down.
Thanks, Ed. Let me introduce, as we get started, our members of the panel today, starting with our chairman of CJP, Tom Aboud, astronaut Charlie Precourt, master instructor Neil Singer, and myself. What we've done at CJP along the way is we've realized that although we train for unusual events in the cockpit, we can't train for everything. And so we put together a video about an incident that actually happened to Tom in the left seat of his CJ3. An unusual occurrence. We'd like to play the video for you, and then we'll come back and have a pre-recorded discussion about the event, and then we'll open it up live for your Q&A. So without further ado, let's play the video.
You know, we train in the simulator for unplanned emergencies, hoping they will never happen. But once in a great while, they do. Let's look at something that happened to a fellow pilot.
Okay, Mitchell, South Dakota, and that's normal for de-ice. Visibility is about a mile, 300 overcast. It's snowing. It's an icing takeoff. We've got our V speeds posted. I've got bleed air on, windshield, pitot-static, engine, tail, wings, and we're going to 5,000. And Mitchell traffic citation 396 Delta Mike taking the active runway 31 northwest departure. Any traffic, please advise. All right, here we go. To the right. Power set. Airspeed's live. 70 knots. V1. Rotate. And positive rate. Whoa, what? Stick shaker? We're not, okay, airspeed. All right, hold Q, pitch, power set. No, it's okay, it's all right. Okay. Let's fly the airplane. Pitch. Stick shaker. All right. And Minneapolis 396 Delta Mike's out of 2.5 for 5,000.
Citation 396 Delta Mike, climb maintain 5,000, right turn 360, radar contact.
And stand by on the turn 6 Delta Mike. Okay. Under control, airspeed, pitch, power. Okay. One to go. Oh, wow. Minneapolis 396 Delta Mike, we are leveling 5,000. We can take that turn now.
Citation 396 Delta Mike, right turn 360, climb maintain 10,000.
360 and 10,000, 396 Delta Mike. Okay. Wow, that was...
Altitude.
That was something. Sometimes the unexpected happens. Right after gear retraction, I got a totally unexpected stick shaker. That's a real eye-opener, especially departing in icing conditions, low IMC, and close to the ground. But I was expecting it. Can you imagine how you would have reacted if it had been you? Well, one person who knows exactly what it's like is sitting right next to me today, the chairman of the Citation Jet Pilots Organization, Mr. Tom Aboud. Tom, welcome.
Hello, David.
So, tell us about the experience. Set up the scenario. What happened?
Well, my family and I were returning from Mitchell, South Dakota to Minneapolis on a Sunday in November last fall, and it had been cold. That day it was light snow, a little wispy snow, 25 degrees. The plane had been on the ramp for a couple of days, so it was cold soaked. And I know pulling up to the plane with my wife and boys, it would be a chilly experience transitioning to getting the airplane going. So I moved through the pre-flight pretty efficiently and got the plane ready to go, and everybody loaded up, and we had a little bit of time from engine start to departure because it's an uncontrolled field.
Right.
It was a very low IMC day, so I had to pick up my clearance on the ground. And during that time, I thought a lot about the various aspects of the flight, the departure, what happens if, and ran through our practices and got ready to go.
So, well, I'm sure it was totally unexpected. What was the first thought that went through your mind, and what was your initial reaction to the stick shaker?
Yeah, well, surprise, of course, and then immediately I was already transitioning to my instruments. The gear came up, stick shaker came on, and having already transitioned, I could see the low speed cue coming up quickly,
right,
which was surprising, and yet I cross-checked against the standby and the co-pilot PFD, and they all agreed that I was pitched up and speed was increasing. So I had a strong feeling that the AOA vane was stuck or somehow misbehaving, and my thought was to get the plane away from the ground. So
right.
I just kept pitched up and on power and kept on going.
So I don't think I have, and you probably haven't. We've never trained for that. That's never that
No,
kind of
nothing
scenario.
like it.
We train for it when we induce it ourselves with a high pitch angle,
Yeah.
with a stick shaker, but never right after a departure like that. So how did you use the training that you had received in order to get yourself out of that situation?
Well, sure. I'd never trained for anything like that, but over 2 decades of going to places like flight safety, and whether it was in a Bonanza or a Baron, a King Air, and now the second citation, the philosophy is the same. If you input certain things, pitch, attitude, and power settings, you're going to get a certain output. And flying that way eliminates a lot of guesswork, particularly in a moment of some kind of abnormal condition like this. So I was able to have a lot of confidence that the plane was going in the right direction. And I could, even while hand flying, I could try and figure out what the problem was. So that was, I guess the part of the training that really benefited me was all that repetition about flying by the numbers.
I think some of us take for granted the stall system and the checks, and I know some airplanes, the heat, various parts of the system are heated when you turn the battery on. Some airplanes when you turn the pitot static. Some are parts of it in each one. How has this incident changed the way you pre-flight that system?
Well, I can tell you that angle of attack vane looks like Wheel of Fortune when I get to it now. I spin it around pretty good. And that's, if I'm chagrined about anything, it's that my pre-flight action had deviated from the checklist. It says free and hot. And I had gotten to the point where I was just grabbing the AOA vane and not really swinging it through its motion. And had I done that, I might have either dislodged it from being stuck or found out that it was stuck, and that would have caused investigation on the ground instead of in the clouds at 200 feet or whatever.
I noticed when I flew this scenario, I forgot to raise the flaps, takeoff flaps. I understand you did the same thing.
I sure did, and that's another item that was a takeaway for me. Is in the heat of the battle, I didn't return to the checklist, and I didn't do my full after takeoff checklist. And sure enough, coming through 10,000 feet, I'm wondering why I'm climbing so at a slow indicated airspeed, and those flaps will slow you down.
But that's pretty minor compared to what you had to go through. So this has been a really, really enlightening discussion, and we really appreciate you coming in and being willing to share to all our members, because these things can be very serious. And the takeaway that I've gotten here is that we can get out of these things. We can use our training. We can use the things we've learned and to make a safe ending for something that could have been serious.
Well, thanks, David.
Thanks
Glad
so
to be here.
Great. Okay, thanks.
With CJP's input, our platinum partner, Flight Safety Textron Aviation Training, is developing new simulator training modules that highlight actual events that our members have experienced. 2 years ago, they developed single-pilot line-oriented simulator training, or LOS scenarios, to support CJP training requests to experiencing more challenging and realistic single-pilot operations. These scenarios enable pilots to enhance their skills with targeted aircraft-specific training in a controlled environment supplemental to their traditional initial and recurrent training. The scenarios meet the requirements of the CJP Gold Standard Safety Award. If you have an event that you would like to share so that others can learn, reach out to us at safety@citationjetpilots.com.
So I still get chills when I see that video. And the next segment that you're going to see is a discussion with Neil and Charlie and Tom about other unusual things that have happened in the cockpit and how we relate to them and how we get out of those situations. Let's play that video. Welcome to the NBAA Single Pilot Safety Stand Down. I'm David Miller, Director of Safety Education for the CJP Safety Foundation. And with me today are Mr. Tom Abood, Chairman of the CJP organization, Neil Singer, Master Instructor and Safety Consultant, and astronaut Charlie Precourt, who's chairman of our safety committee. That's a mouthful. Welcome, guys.
Great to be here, David.
Thanks, David.
Glad to have you all here. The topic of today's discussion is ambiguous cockpit indications, and hopefully each of you have had an opportunity to watch a video, which was a reenactment of an actual event that happened to our very own Tom Abood. And something I wanted to ask you, Tom, since we are lucky enough to have you here, is to talk a little bit about the element of surprise. I know we don't get to train for what happened to you, but how did you deal with it? And did you ever have any situation in another airplane that might have prepared you for that event?
Well, there certainly is surprise to have a stick shaker that close to the ground right after takeoff, and surprise was the first feeling I had. And there is a strong urge from prior training, stall training, right from light singles all the way up to the jet, when you get a stall indication, to take stall avoidance steps, like push the nose down. And when your stick shaker is going hard, you think you have to restrain yourself, at least that close to the ground, from pushing the nose down and assess the situation. I don't know that I've had anything else that's similar to that, but what I can say is that simulator training and lots of in-aircraft training leads you to down a path. Let's see what instrument is agreeing, what's not agreeing, and try and diagnose it quickly in that way. And I was able to look quickly at the standby instrument and the co-pilot instrument, the airspeed tapes and pitch attitude indications, and confirm pretty quickly that I was pointed up and accelerating. So I didn't think I had a stall, impending stall, given my speeds. And that gave me the confidence to continue moving away from the ground, not react to the stick shaker by pushing the nose down, and get higher and sort it out when I was at a different altitude.
I know you had your family on board, Tom. Did they notice the event? Was it any distraction, being there by yourself in the cockpit?
Actually, there was no distraction, and they didn't notice, which says a lot more about my kids' attention to their iPads than anything else.
Well, we're great that it turned out okay. And for a lot of our viewers today, they may not be familiar with a stick shaker. What is a stick shaker? Neil, can you talk a little bit about what is a stick shaker and why do some airplanes have it?
So, David, a stick shaker is one form of stall warning device that is found in a lot of turbojet airplanes. Some other turbojets may have a stall horn. Some have a verbal stall that repeats. Stalled, 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 stalled. There's a bunch of different ways the manufacturer can comply with the requirement, but a stick shaker is a pretty common one. In the case of the 525, such as Tom was flying, there's a single AOA vane on the right side of the airframe, and the AOA vane, angle of attack vane, just pivots when everything's working well into the relative wind. And of course, by knowing the relationship between the relative wind and the fixed axis of the airplane, the system can do some calculations and can determine indirectly the angle of attack. So because we're depending on a vane that needs to rotate freely, of course, there's a couple ways this can go wrong. A few years ago, there was a situation which was the opposite of Tom's. CJ2 Plus was climbing at high altitude, 43,000 feet, and the angle of attack vane was stuck at an angle relative to the airframe that would indicate there was no problem, that the angle of attack was small. So this particular pilot never received a stick shaker, ended up letting the airspeed decay down.
What is a stick shaker? Neil, can you talk a little bit about what is a stick shaker and why do some airplanes have it?
So, David, a stick shaker is one form of stall warning device that is found in a lot of turbojet airplanes. Some other turbojets may have a stall horn. Some have a verbal stall that repeats.
Stalled, 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 stalled.
There's a bunch of different ways the manufacturer can comply with the requirement, but a stick shaker is a pretty common one. In the case of the 525, such as Tom was flying, there's a single AOA vane on the right side of the airframe, and the AOA vane, angle of attack vane, just pivots when everything's working well into the relative wind. And of course, by knowing the relationship between the relative wind and the fixed axis of the airplane, the system can do some calculations and can determine indirectly the angle of attack. So because we're depending on a vane that needs to rotate freely, of course, there's a couple ways this can go wrong. A few years ago, there was a situation which was the opposite of Tom's. CJ2 Plus was climbing at high altitude, 43,000 feet, and the angle of attack vane was stuck at an angle relative to the airframe that would indicate there was no problem, that the angle of attack was small. So this particular pilot never received a stick shaker, ended up letting the airspeed decay down to the actual stall speed of the aircraft, and had a pretty violent stall. Fortunately, it was able to recover without any serious injuries to any occupants, but the airplane was pretty seriously damaged. In Tom's case, so what's happening is the angle of attack, if it thinks the angle of attack is higher than it actually is, then even at a high airspeed, so 160 knots in a 1G situation at a normal weight would be well above the stall speed for a CJ3. But if the angle of attack vane is stuck in a position that makes the computer think the plane's actually at a high angle of attack, then regardless of what the airspeed is, the system will ultimately show the indications as if the airplane's flying at or above the critical angle of attack. Because, of course, we all remember from private pilot training that an airplane with a stall speed of 100 knots could stall at 160 knots. We just have to put enough load on the airplane, right? So a very steep bank, a very steep pull-up, turbulence. So there is no one fixed stall speed once we start talking about the variable loads that can be put on the airplane.
Tom, we really appreciate you joining us today and being able to share your event. The fact that you shared it with our organization and with many other pilots has enabled us to educate all pilots about these kinds of things. And if it wasn't for your event and your willingness to share, we wouldn't be here. Any final takeaways or thoughts you have on the incident?
Well, sure. Neil referred to in his comments the potential for a stuck stick shaker to deliver that response, and I got it. One of the things I took away from this was that my pre-flight action had varied a little bit from the checklist. The checklist calls for checking that the angle of attack vane is hot, but also free, and you're supposed to rotate it. I had gotten to the habit of just touching it for heat and not rotating it. And it was a cold day that day in Mitchell, South Dakota, and the plane had been out on the ramp for a couple of nights. And so I don't know that the pre-flight check would have changed the outcome, but it would have alerted me to the fact that the angle of attack vane was stuck if it was indeed frozen, and I believe it was.
Wow, that's great information, Tom, and we really appreciate you joining us today. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Thank you all.
Thanks. Hey, Charlie, ambiguous cockpit indications are not just limited to a stick shaker. Can you talk about these type of events and how they might have happened to you? I bet you have a lot of stories from NASA or the military.
Indeed, I think Tom's is a really good example because of the nature when it occurred close to the ground. It really grabs your attention. These things can come in a lot of forms. That's why we call them ambiguous. I'm going to share a few with you here. This one I call airspeed confusion, as you alluded to in the military and at NASA. In flying the T-38s, this one was a frozen pitot tube as opposed to an AOA indicating probe. This was self-induced. I was taking off in full afterburner out of El Paso one afternoon, headed back to Houston. left the pitot heat switch off, which is down there in the lower center of the picture. And as I was climbing through 23,000 feet, went into some light clouds, and the pitot tube predictably just froze up. And I'm continuing to climb, and I've got good pitch attitude, and I'm climbing at a rate that I expected for that altitude and power setting. But my airspeed started to pick up really dramatically. And so it caused some confusion. What's going on here? Recheck my attitude, recheck my airspeed, look at the standby indicator. And sure enough, the pitot tube was not heating. When the pitot tube freezes in a climb, of course, you've frozen the pressure into the pitot, but in the climb, the static pressure is still dropping. The difference between them increases, and therefore your airspeed increases. And so guess what? The airspeed accelerates. So threw the pitot heat back on, and the airspeed dropped to where it should be, and all was fine. But this can happen to any of us. Everybody who flies instruments will have a pitot heater of some sort, and this is the very phenomenon that can happen to them. It becomes even more insidious when it happens in level flight, and everything's fine for a while until you go to change your altitude, either descending or climbing. So something to be aware of is what that looks like when that happens. Another one, not only confusing airspeed, how about no airspeed? This is an important one. This was when I was flying a MiG-21 Warbird for some airshow work. We were out doing a post-maintenance flight, and the airspeed went to 0. And you can see the gauge there on the upper left of the cockpit. And in this case, I had decent familiarity with the airplane, flown it quite a bit, and I knew pitch and power settings and configurations that resulted in various airspeeds. So I flew the pitch, power, and landing configuration, got my normal sight picture for a 3-degree glide path, flew a nice long straight in, made sure everything looked normal. Even though I didn't have airspeed, it really didn't matter because I was flying by those pitch and power settings for the configuration and the glide path that made sense. And it, in fact, turned into a non-event, landed without issue. But the point I want to make out of this is there's something that all of us can do with any of our airplanes is to fill out a table like this and understand for an approximate speed with varying configurations, gear and flaps up, gear and flaps down, climbing, level, or descending, what do you have for your power settings, fuel flows, RPMs, manifold pressure, whatever your reference is. Make life easy for yourself. Memorize these, and you'll be in great shape. Even if everything's working, this makes life easy for normal instrument work because you go to the power setting for what you want, you go to the attitude for what you want, and the airplane stays there, giving you the bandwidth and the time to do other things like checklists, set up approaches, and talk on the radio. So this is a very important thing that we all should be doing. Because I had done this for the MiG-21, that approach turned out to be a no-brainer, even though that dang thing comes down final at 140 knots. So it's a very fast and sleek airplane. Chose a runway that was nice and long, you know, and it was a nice VFR day where I was going and had, you know, good conditions and just flew the settings. So all worked out very well.
So Charlie, you could laminate that and put that in your airplane and just be able to refer to it at any time for any airplane, right?
That's absolutely right, David. This one's generic. This was from my days in the PA-46 when I flew a jet prop. But you should be able to do the maneuvers that you normally do: a radar downwind, gear and flaps up, approaching the final approach fix maybe with just flaps down, and then with gear and flaps down level, and then on the glide path for climbs for missed approach with gear and flaps down. Anything that you do routinely in terms of maneuvers, you could fill out a table like this and just keep it with you. Eventually you'll memorize them because you'll get in the habit of looking for that power setting when you're in that configuration, and you just use it. And it makes life a lot easier flying through the different maneuvers and scenarios. So the last one I'll share real quick is something that happened to me in the citation. There's a device in the integrated avionics package that's called a configuration strapping unit, and the dang thing failed on me. And it results in this really bizarre grouping of avionics failure indications. The CSU really takes every other box that's in the system and integrates it so that it can be displayed appropriately on the MFDs and the PFDs. So things like your GPSs, the VOR localizers, the ground proximity warning, radar, autopilot, flight directors, FMS inputs, you name it, all of that stuff gets integrated in a way that's configured. That's why they call it a configuration strapping unit for your airplane. So there's no checklist procedure for this. It's just a bunch of cues that pop up. And it turned out of all those cues, there was only one that was actionable. It was the flight director message. There's an FD on the PFD that's circled there in yellow. I looked at that. It, in fact, had me swap the autopilot to the other side. That got me some of the display information back, but it didn't get me the autopilot back. So it was the only thing that mattered. But you can see on the MFD, pretty much nothing instead of good situational awareness. On the PFD, pretty much nothing except a lot of warnings instead of my autopilot and navigation information. And then on the FMS, you know, V-speeds deselected, FMS navs invalid, GNSS not available, instead of having a nice legs page for my navigation. So this was taken off out of an airport in Iowa, headed back to Ogden. It was late in the afternoon, about an hour from sunset, hour and a half from sunset on a 3-hour flight. But I still had all the Piper Cub stuff: aviate, navigate, communicate, airplanes flying right. Other than I can't use the avionics. No autopilot, can't go into RVS airspace. By the way, due to that, I don't have range to go very far. But I don't need to be flying this kind of thing at night anyway, so divert to a VFR place like, in my case, Centennial Airport in Denver. Perfect for nice long runway, still going to be daylight, hand flying it. All of that stuff worked out just fine. But, you know, just take, like Tom just said, take, with his situation, take a good assessment of all that you have. What are you able to discern from the indication you have, and what can you do with the airplane? So another one that can strike with really no warning, and in this case, there's not a whole lot of guidance for it. You got to do the best you can with the situation you have, and it's very ambiguous. And with modern electronics, ambiguous seems to be the name of the game when they fail, because they can fail in odd ways. So those are the kinds of things that I've had in my experience, David. So back to you.
You know, Charlie, I guess it comes down to 3 words: fly the airplane.
Aviate, navigate, communicate. That's exactly right. Yep, right. In that order. Yep.
Neil, I know you have a couple more examples. You want to talk about those?
Yeah, absolutely, David. So we've been talking about an angle of attack vane being stuck and generating some confusion, but there's all sorts of things in the cockpit that can potentially create ambiguity and confusion. You know, picture the situation, you know, you're being vectored at 1,500 feet above the airport on the downwind, about to turn base and intercept the ILS right outside the final approach fix. And you get distracted for a second looking down at the approach plate, and the autopilot clicks off, and you hear the autopilot disconnect warning, and you look up at your PFD and you see this. I think a lot of us, first instinct might be to look as David Miller would in this situation and have a panicked reaction and feel like, oh my God, I have to do something right now to solve the problem. But before we start grabbing controls and throwing inputs in there, what if we looked at the rest of the cockpit and we saw this? That's a very different picture. Okay, so in this particular airplane, we have 3 different sources of attitude information: 2 independent AHRs and then an independent attitude sensor in the standby instrument. And when we look at the standby instrument and we look at the right side PFD, we see that we're just as we last were when we looked away from the screens. We're straight and level, flying around at an appropriate speed, being vectored for the approach. So it's important to cross-check information and to not make a very hasty input based on a faulty data source. Other examples of the need to cross-check information, I've seen this in simulator training. A favorite of sim instructors is to fail the flaps in a 525, where the pilot will extend the flaps to the landing position. But if we're looking at the actual indication of the flaps, this small tab right next to up shows that the flaps never moved. And I've seen a lot of pilots in the simulator never catch this and proceed with the landing as if their flaps were in the landing position, because that's where the handle is. Another example I've seen in a real aircraft actually was on departure from a more or less sea level airport, climbing through a couple thousand feet. The pilot reads the after takeoff climb checklist, and one of the line items is pressurization checked. And the pilot will just read that item quickly and move on to the next one. And I again saw this actually happen in a Mustang. So the pilot reads pressurization checked, but of course, if we look at the actual indications, there is no pressurization. There's zero differential pressure, meaning that the pressure outside the airplane is the same as the pressure inside. The cabin altitude is 1,400 feet, which corresponds to the altitude that the plane's at, and the cabin altitude is climbing 3,000 feet per minute, the same as the airplane is. So it's important to check these indications and to maybe sometimes slow our brain down a little bit and make sure we understand what we're looking at.
Neil, you have been talking, and we've been talking about examples in jets and faster airplanes, but these kind of things happen in small airplanes too. Can you talk a little bit about that? I know you fly small airplanes.
Absolutely. And, that's a great segue for my next point, which is that the majority of the time, whatever type of aircraft we're flying, the first instinct should be to slow down. And I like to tell people your first instinct should be to check your attitude, because what we frequently see is, Charlie outlined a couple great ones. We see pitot-static error. We see a total failure of an instrument. And for most of our airplanes, if we know some basic attitude settings and some basic power settings, as Charlie pointed out, we can get the airplane into a safe state where we then can, in a more relaxed manner, troubleshoot what's happening. What we want to do, though, is make sure the airplane is climbing away from the ground, pointed in a safe direction, which is generally going to be up. So the last slide I want to leave you with is for a non-citation, but for another jet that I fly. They actually have a memory item for unreliable airspeed. In this particular case, this is if your airspeed indication, your pitot-static information maybe was compromised, but it's just as applicable to the situation that Tom experienced. And what I want to draw your attention to, the first couple steps are just to get rid of the autopilot and flight director, because they might be either following bad information or confusing, misleading. But the important items to me in this memory item are steps 4 and 5, which says if you're below the MSA, if you're below the minimum safe altitude that you're flying at, this is a memory item. We don't pull out any checklists. We're going to put our airplane to 15 degrees pitch, nose up, and we're going to put our thrust levers to take off thrust, and then basically initiate a go around, clean up any flaps or gear that might be out. But really the first key step the pilot's taking here is put the plane at a safe pitch attitude and power setting that will ensure it's climbing away from the ground. If we have our wings level and we're pitched up 15 degrees, and they make a point later on that if you're above 15,000 feet, you could decrease the pitch to 10 degrees just to make sure the plane doesn't stall. Although most jets aren't going to stall at 15 degrees nose up until they're well above 15,000 feet. If we have the plane at a comfortable pitch up, wings level, climb thrust in, we really have a lot of time to troubleshoot. We've taken care of the most critical step to avoid a loss of control in flight. So maybe in a piston airplane, we might use a slightly lower pitch setting. Real low power airplane, maybe we pitch up to 5 degrees. Maybe something like a Cirrus or a Baron with more power, we might pitch up to 10 degrees. But I think this really should be a memory item for any airplane that we fly, which is if we have any confusion about our airspeed state, to put the plane in a safe attitude with proper power, get away from the ground, keep the wings level, and then try to troubleshoot calmly when we know we're in a safe state.
Neil, your previous slide said check your attitude, as in pitch attitude, but we also need to think about our mental attitude too, don't we? As in, don't panic. If we go to what we know about the airplane and how it will perform, we can do things more safely without panicking.
Absolutely. And, there's a favorite story that goes around in aviation it's probably apocryphal, but it's a great story to share nonetheless, which is a pilot is in simulator recurrent training, and the sim instructor gives them an emergency, an engine failure, doesn't really matter what. And the pilot pulls a pocket watch out of his pocket and starts winding his watch. And the sim instructor looks at him and says, "Hey, what are you doing? I just gave you an engine failure. Why aren't you starting to follow the checklist? What are you doing winding your watch?" And the pilot looks back at him and says, "Well, as far as I know, no one's ever been killed winding a watch." And the takeaway is people can get killed doing things in a hurry that are the wrong input. There's a great video floating around the internet of a airline wide body a sim session where an engine has failed and the pilots in their haste shut down the operating engine. There was a tragic accident in the Far East a couple of years ago of a commuter turboprop where that unfortunately happened for real. The pilot reacted incorrectly, shut down the wrong engine. So there are unfortunately examples of pilots following the wrong instinct in a hurry, in a race to act, and maybe they should have been winding their watch. You know, maybe by taking a little bit of extra time, the plane wasn't in a critical energy state. They could have taken 5-10 seconds and they would have had a more successful outcome.
Well said. Charlie, any final comments?
This is really important that Neil and you both alluded to resorting back to what we know. The biggest defense against these ambiguous indications is our aircraft systems knowledge and performance knowledge, and being able to rely on what we know is really crucial. So I've found in flying with, literally hundreds of other pilots, those who know the systems best are able to take the time and pause before they take a rash action, because they're looking for other cues that they can expect are trustworthy. And winding the watch is something I learned back in the late 60s, early 70s when I was first learning to fly, is don't do anything until you've wound your watch, then come back to the activity. Certainly everything with a grain of salt, right? There are probably 2 or 3, 4 things in our flying that we got to respond to immediately. An engine failure at V1, a V1 cut, if you don't step on the rudder and manage the airplane, you're not flying the airplane. But if it's aviate and you need to maneuver quickly, then certainly you have to. But if it's aviate, navigate, communicate in that order, and you take the time to think through things, you'll be much better off. Because ambiguous is by definition going to be confusing. It's going to put a big question mark over your head until you take the time to sort it out. And I'll just close with a connection to Space Shuttle accident Columbia that we all remember. The Columbia, of course, was lost on reentry due to a hole in the leading edge of the wing. And nobody knew that it was there because the damage had occurred on launch due to a piece of foam off the tank, punctured a hole in the leading edge. And the impact of that didn't raise itself until reentry with the hot gases, 2,500 degree gases coming in through the wing. And you talk about ambiguous indications. The entire flight control center and the crew were responding to things like low tire pressure when they were just barely re-entering the atmosphere, body flap, hydraulics, things that were not even systems that were ready to be turned on and used yet. The sensors on those systems were being activated by the hot flow into the wing. And so they had their hands full, and a whole control center could be confused by these ambiguous things. So knowledge of the system is our only defense for that, and do what we can trust when we analyze the situation first.
That's great information. Really enlightening discussion, guys. We hope you have enjoyed this. There's, I'm sure, more information available on the NBAA website. In addition, you can always go to the citationjetpilots.com website and click on the safety tab, and we have free information for any pilot, regardless of what they fly. So thanks so much for watching, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, David.
Unmute Mike. There we go. Now we're back live. We'd like to invite your questions to our two guys. And I wanted to start it off with a comment about, we talk about maintaining control of the airplane, but we don't talk much about maintaining emotional control. We are all wired differently. Charlie Precourt, astronaut Precourt, could command the space shuttle in English and Russian simultaneously. Neil Singer can sit in the right seat while he's examining somebody and be wired to take over control instantaneously if he has to. I can't do those kind of things. So how do we know ourselves or think about how we react individually in times of stress? You guys have any? I know that's a difficult question, but any comments about that?
Sure. I mean, I'd say I think a good analogy is doing hypoxia training. The trainers who do hypoxia chamber training or the reduced pressure breathing apparatus, they maintain that you will have repeatable symptoms when you experience hypoxia. So the big part of the value is understanding what your symptoms are going to be. I think the same thing can be said for emotional overload. I've been with a lot of new jet pilots in their first sim session. They'll come out of the simulator with a soaking wet shirt. Their hands are shaking because that first 2-hour experience was so realistic to them and felt so visceral, felt really life-threatening, that it really compelled a similar physiological reaction. So I think going through the training and exposing yourself to these type of things, you're going to learn what your emotional response is. You're going to be more aware of when you're starting to have this heightened response. And at some point, maybe you'll become a little more inured to it. And if it ever happens for real in the airplane, you'll have that training to fall back on to slow the pace down, wind the watch, and be methodical rather than acting from a really adrenalized state.
That's a good point. Charlie, here's a question from the audience. Training seems to be a core component of well-prepared pilot, but training is expensive. What can owners do to help keep their skills proficient without breaking the bank?
Well, so the training is expensive is something that every one of us should evaluate. What is the value of your life and the life of your loved ones when you're in an airplane? And the best way to, I think, keep up with your proficiency is to make sure that you're involved in some kind of training, whether it be the most expensive, motion-based simulator platform or just home study. You got to be involved in it regularly. So I have kind of a mnemonic for that. It's the 1-1-1. So once a day, and what we have at CJP is facilitated by emails, but once a day we get a systems question on an email. And, it's a multiple choice question, and I'm sitting at breakfast and I answer the question, and my head is in the game about systems at least once a day for 2 or 3 minutes. And then once a week, I'll take the time to actually write out the memory items on a blank piece of paper. And I'll spend an hour once a week going through and reading some part of a chapter of the pilot's operating handbook. And then when I am in flight, at least once per flight, I'll pull out the emergency procedures, and while I'm sitting in the cockpit at altitude when it's quiescent on cruise, I'll run through looking at the switches and just refreshing constantly over and over and over again. So this 1-1-1, once a day, once a week, once per flight, you stay in a groove. And then when you do the more expensive training, you're really up on the step, and it's just a nice refresher and reinforcement of the things you need to be able to recall in real time. So.
That's good. Neil, here's one that's kind of dear to our hearts. Is there a way to push for changing the training scenarios at the training providers? I've been going there for years, and it seems like they always want to do exactly the same thing. I feel like training could be much better by including real-world scenarios like these. Comments?
Well, that's a pretty big topic for a few minutes. That's certainly something we've wrestled with at CJP. Trying to encompass more real-world training. My big pitch when I talk to people about simulator training is to be proactive. The more you can get in front of your training, the better. There are some things you can do in terms of training centers that will accommodate a progressive 6158 proficiency check. That will often free up some time at the end of each sim session. But you often have to come in prepared to direct that extra time. I think anybody who's been to a sim training center has had the experience where you're done 15 minutes early and the sim instructor says, okay, let's go get some coffee. But if you're prepared and you say, hey, could we actually do a AHAR slow roll? Could we actually do a loss of control at 1,000 AGL? If you have a few ideas, in my experience, they're always willing to accommodate that. but they're also willing to just cut the session short if you don't push back a little bit. So I think, again, getting in front of it is key there.
Charlie, here's one for the folks that fly airplanes that are not involved with simulators or not available to them. Do you have any recommendations for extra training and training technique with partial panel?
Well, certainly you want to do that with an instructor, but by all means, you don't have to have a simulator for these things. Neil and I have talked many times about the benefits of a simulator versus the benefits of in-flight training, and we believe there's a balance. And you want to use the simulator to train in those things that you wouldn't dare do in an airplane, like a V1 cut while you're still in rotation on the runway, or other failure scenarios such as high-speed descent for a simulated cabin depressurization. The simulator is an ideal place for those, but certainly for partial panel, there is no reason that with an instructor you couldn't be doing that kind of training in the airplane. And again, the best way is to remember to fall back on those simple, power, attitude power, and get the airplane stable, and then look around the cockpit for the other things that you have to help you to fly the airplane. The thing I've found with partial panel is it's just lots of practice, because you cross-check, your scan has to change a little bit. So the more you can practice that, and it needs regular, recurrent kinds of training to not have it go stale. By all means, get in an airplane with an instructor and practice that. Come down an ILS final partial panel. It's a great exercise, and it really enhances your stick and rudder skills.
Here's one that maybe I can help with. Is there a program available to assist single pilot operators that would allow a non-pilot family member or business associate the ability to be a resource on the flight deck, something similar to the program put on by Mitsubishi for the MU2 operators that allows another person to be a resource? As a matter of fact, CJP has been working closely with flight safety since the beginning of the year on a brand new companion course that we will introduce at our convention this month, actually. It is a 3 hour classroom scenario, 4 hour classroom, followed by a 2 hour sim session where we take a companion, an untrained pilot or a business associate, and actually teach them the skills necessary to take over for an incapacitated pilot. I would encourage all of you that train with any provider to push for that, because our companions are an incredible resource. My wife, Patty, reads the checklist. Charlie, I know Lynn, your wife does. Neil, you may have the same situation, but we don't often take the advantage of the resources that are available in our cockpit. And so you guys have any comments about that?
I would pile on there, David. I think for those who, whether you're in a Mooney, a Cirrus, a Bonanza, there are means by which you can do this for your frequent companion in the aircraft, even if you don't have the benefit of a simulator provider helping create the curriculum. Get with a good instructor in that particular airplane and go through the whole process of from the time you arrive at the airplane to go on a flight till you put it back in the hangar. What are the things that you do that you could put that burden on another person that you trust, that has gone through an instructional scenario with you and an instructor in that airplane, knowing how to close the cabin door, knowing how to package the baggage compartments in a safe manner, knowing how to listen on the radio to help back you up for misunderstood calls, even information on the ATIS. Maybe you miswrite down your clearance. The more that you can get that second person to be a useful resource, that's what single pilot crew resource management is all about. But you got to start from the very beginning and walk diligently through an entire flight profile, which is where, if you're not a CFI yourself, or you want some assistance in building a program like that, you don't have to have a simulator provider. Go get a really good CFI in that particular airframe and do it together. And you'll find it's a great exercise just for you as well as for the companion, because now you start to build a crew relationship with that companion so that they know what you're doing and you know what they can do.
And Neil, to follow up on what Charlie said about memory items, one question sent in here is, how do we practice memory items, especially in the situation of COVID where we're not flying as much?
It's a great question, and it actually talks to the other question about how we keep our costs down for training. Something that's absolutely free for an aircraft owner is time in the cockpit with the power off. Right, it costs us nothing to go sit in the cockpit. Also, a cockpit poster. I am a huge proponent of drilling in front of a large 2x3 or larger poster of the cockpit. There's been some interesting research that different parts of our brain are used when we move our body and when we speak. So doing simultaneous actions of reaching out as if you're going to touch a switch and then enunciating verbally what you're doing and practicing those memory items either, again, in your cockpit with the power off or in front of a cockpit poster is totally free. And I can really tell a difference in training and in check rides with pilots who've done that a lot and pilots who maybe haven't done it much or haven't done it recently. And it's a powerful tool.
Great. Any final comments, guys, before we turn it back to Ed?
I'm just delighted that we've had the opportunity to participate. Always prefer being in person and having that interaction, but working together with the whole community of single pilot operators, it's really important that we take advantage of each other's experience to do better incrementally every year. And one thing that we've talked about before, and this kind of goes to the cost of training and what we can do to improve training, is there's a lot of work coming along in the future with FOQA data, even for light airplanes now. And that data can be used by you as an individual to feed the simulator providers to tailor your training. And I think we can all look forward to many changes in the coming years based on the availability of that data to actually change the nature of simulator training. One of the questions was, why do I have to keep doing the same thing all the time? Why can't I do the scenario-based stuff? I'm encouraged that I think it's coming, and I think it's going to be on the foundation of new data from our everyday flying in the form of FOQA that can feed our simulators. So.
Wonderful. Mr. Boland?
Well, David, a great deal of thanks and gratitude go to you and your team at CJP for a really extraordinary session this afternoon. Charlie, Neil, Tom, that was all enormously interesting, and it really built on the foundation that we had this morning. So many of the themes from this morning were reinforced and really taken to a whole new flight level. So just a lot of gratitude for Textron Aviation for sponsoring this program and all of you for participating. We're going to pick up tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, where the three of you, Charlie, David, and Neil, will be back with us to talk about excellence on approach. I think it will be another fascinating session. Immediately after that, NBAA is going to pivot, where we are going to shine a bright spotlight on 40 individuals under 40 years old who are really setting the stage for our industry to move forward. And then at 1 o'clock, we will come back with what I think is going to be another terrific panel where we will have Tom Turner from the American Bonanza Society and Todd Simmons from Cirrus Aircraft Company. So we are off to a great week of aviation excellence. And I'm really pleased and proud to see so many people from our industry who have stepped forward, volunteered their time and expertise to give us their insights, their training, their perspectives that will help us be safe and be perceived to be safe. Thank you all for being part of today. We'll look forward to seeing you at 11 a.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, where we pick up again with our single pilot safety stand down.
Thank you so much, Ed. As a reminder, this session has been recorded and will be available starting on Monday, October 12th at pathlms.com/NBAA. Thanks again to our sponsor, Textron Aviation, as we conclude the second session of NBAA's Single Pilot Safety Stand Down. We'll be back with you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern for the third session of NBAA's Single Pilot Safety Stand Down called Excellence on the Approach. To our participants, thank you again for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of NBAA's Virtual Safety Week.